Defined human security as the following. Firstly, safety from chronic threats such as hunger, disease, and repression. Safety from chronic threats such as hunger, disease, and repression. Now, think of security studies specialists. Think of realists studying the national security paradigm. They're confronted with the idea of hunger and disease being security threats. Beforehand, they were seen as developmental goals. The assumption was hunger is a result of underdevelopment. There is hunger in developing societies because they are not developed enough. But by defining human security as safety from chronic threats, such as hunger and disease, the UNDP are saying, look, hunger and disease are threats. They're existential threats, threats to our existence. We have to do something about it. Now notice repression. What here does repression refer to? What do you understand by repression? Psychologically, there are many different types of repression. But what type of repression are we looking at here? The problem with this is then we have to set up a criteria for justice. It's far more difficult. But what do we really understand by repression?
Under control.
So what does the state do? I think this is pretty obvious if we look at
take away the rights, basic rights.
Take away rights, and what else? How is the state defined if we look at Weber? What does the state do? It's the use of violence, yeah. States are founded on violence. Repression is violence by the state on its own people. That's what repression means. Violence by the state against its own people. Now, what is the consequence of this for national security, the national security paradigm? Who is meant to look after our security? The state. But what we're saying here in the UNDP Human Development Report is the state itself is a source of insecurity. It is the state which takes away our security. And repression is equivalent to hunger and disease as an existential threat. So this is a completely different paradigm of international relations. Not just of international relations, of security. A different conception, a different understanding of security. It's the security of everyday life. Security of people who feel threatened, who are hungry, who are dying of diseases. At this time, this was the HIV/AIDS crisis, where something like 40% of the population of places like Swaziland, Botswana, were dying of HIV/AIDS, which was seen as incurable, mainly dying of malaria, which was preventable. So here we find disease as an important human security threat. But notice the term security. What security does is to securitize. It gets people's attention. It says, look, we have to do something. Now, this is an assumption. I do not have the facts to back this up. But my own view is if the UNDP had not used the term security, maybe we would not have had the Millennium Development Goals of 2000. Because the Millennium Development Goals were goals which were set universally to halve global poverty by 2015. That urgency comes from using the language of security. Now, critics talk about the securitization of development. Development then becomes securitized. It's no longer a choice. We'll look at that tomorrow. But the important point is the use of this term, the use of this language. Now, it gets even broader. The UNDP report defined human security not only as safety from chronic threats such as hunger, disease, and repression, but protection from sudden and hurtful disruptions in patterns of daily life, whether in jobs, in homes, or in communities. Now, what may be a source of this sudden and hurtful disruption in patterns of everyday life? Sorry? Yes, correct. Correct?
Financial crisis.
Correct. Where have we seen this before? Where have we seen? Huh? Sorry? And what gave rise to non-traditional security threats? Globalization. So what this report is doing is saying neoliberal globalization, which is leading to economic development, which is meant to be developing the world, can be a threat to human security. So this is the broadest statement of human security. So globalization itself is a threat to our human security because it causes sudden and hurtful disruptions in patterns of daily life. We may earn more money, but at the same time, our tenure is more insecure. You may get a job as an IT worker and live in Silicon Valley and make hundreds of thousands of dollars, but you'll be there for 3 years, you'll have a special visa, and then afterwards, if your company goes under, you would have to go back to India. There's a lot of disruption. There is a lot of movement, and a lot of this disruption is hurtful. If you look at the millions of workers within India and within China who cannot afford to live in expensive cities like Delhi, but work in Delhi. They have to, live in other parts of the UP and go into Delhi every day in order to work, but cannot afford places here. Same is happening in London, in New York, and in other places. So globalization, which brings about the need for human security, is itself a source of human insecurity. Now, this enabled the UNDP, as aptly summarized by Professor Alam in the inaugural event, to look at different categories of security. So for them, human security meant or encompassed economic security, meaning poverty, economic downturns, food security, hunger and famine, health security, disease and injuries, Environmental security. Notice, environmental security is encompassed in human security, even though, as we argued beforehand, humans are actually the biggest source of insecurity for the environment. So pollution. Delhi is still, I think, the world's most polluted city. And resource scarcity is also seen as environmental security. This is important for human security, for us. Personal security, security from physical violence, natural disasters. Community security, racial, ethnic, gender, cultural, and religious discrimination. I have a problem with this, the way it's deployed within the report, because it's just one of many types of security in the list. But the point I want to make, political security, systematic torture, political repression, structural violence. Structural violence means violence which emanates from structures of unequal power. This is Johan Galtung's definition. So you could argue that a structure of unequal power could be patriarchy, it could be capitalism itself. Structural violence is embedded within capitalism. This could be one argument. But the point to make is that all of these different categories are encompassed within a broader concept of human security. Now, my very cynical question is, what do you think international relations scholars and security studies scholars did about this report? What was their reaction to the UNDP Human Development Report?
Some say it's too boring.
Very good. What did the others say? Sorry? Excellent, but you can also turn this around and you can say, this is not security. That's what they said, yeah. If this is security, what is not? This is not security. So those security scholars who took it seriously way afterwards. Roland Paris was talking in 2001 when he said hot air, human security is hot air. Basically, the key argument was that this is not security, this is development. What are you talking about? These are a group of economists, developmental economists. They're trying to make themselves look like security specialists by using the term security. That's not security, this is development. But we mentioned the date 1994. Now, the ICISS report was commissioned by Kofi Annan in 1999. What event happened in 1999? Firstly, where was Kofi Annan from? Ghana. Okay, so what had happened in his continent in 1994? The Rwandan, genocide in inverted commas. So, what happened in 1999? People may forget, I don't, because I first started teaching then. Huh? Okay, that's 98, 99? Correct. But outside of South Asia. That was a pretty important war. In a different continent. What? At least we're in the same right continent. Not Eurozone, but we're in the right continent within Europe. Something happened in Europe.
Euro came in existence.
I should clarify. ICISS stands for International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty. So they're really not interested in economics. So what happened to do with intervention and state sovereignty in 1999? In Europe. No? What crisis, major crisis? Involving the UN or not involving the UN? I'm very surprised, particularly.
In 1998, it happened the financial crisis of
No economics. No, that's broad approach. Very good, Kosovo. See, I would have thought people at Jamia would, remember this. So what happened in Kosovo? Kosovo was part of Serbia. Serbia was part of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. What was happening in Kosovo? Huh? Ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing of who? Who was being ethnically cleansed? Yeah, I wouldn't say Muslims by Christians, but particularly by Albanians, Muslim Albanians, by the forces of the Yugoslav People's Liberation Army. So it was not, I would not say it was there was a religious dimension to the conflict, but it wasn't primarily religious. But this was ethnic cleansing. So what happened? Ethnic cleansing had happened within Bosnia. I've been to Bosnia earlier this year. The UN did nothing. Intervention happened. Now, who carried out the intervention? NATO, yeah. Now, interestingly, NATO intervenes. What is NATO? This is really interesting because I thought NATO had disappeared by then. What was NATO set up to do? Collective security against who? Huh? It wasn't called Russia. And what had happened to the USSR 9 years beforehand? It collapsed. Yet NATO was still there. I couldn't believe it. NATO is still there, and all of a sudden they intervene. Now, how is this part of international law? How can NATO intervene? NATO is a collective security organization, association, an alliance. The individual states of NATO did not intervene, but NATO intervened because they were not covered by international law. So how does this impact, very cynically speaking, upon the UN? Excellent, yeah. So I think there are two dimensions here. Firstly, Kofi Annan is saying, hang on, why Kosovo are not Rwanda? So in Kosovo, the ethnic cleansing was nothing like the scale of Rwanda. It wasn't even on the scale of Bosnia. Yet there was intervention. Secondly, you have an intervention which takes place without approval from the United Nations, Security Council, which is responsible for peace and security. And this takes place without any consultation. So we're intervening. It has nothing to do with you. So within international legal circles, this gave rise to a view, a judgment, which said that it was illegal but legitimate. Illegal but legitimate intervention. It was legitimate because it was there to prevent ethnic cleansing. But it was illegal. You can't do this. The UN system was not, the UN Security Council was not even consulted. So that was the background to the ICISS report. It was to examine the grounds for humanitarian intervention. And they came up with the idea that states have a responsibility to protect, I say their citizens here, but that's shorthand. It's not really their citizens, it's people who live on their territory. Now, there is a difference between citizens and people who live on their territory. So let us look at arguably the most tragic event of the 20th century, if we look at the Holocaust. Now, I'm going to make, following Carl Schmitt, a very controversial statement, which I think is correct, which is that the Nazi generals in the Nuremberg trials, when they replied that they did nothing wrong and they were only following orders, I think legally they were correct. They were legally correct because they were indicted on a crime, crimes against humanity, which was formulated after the acts. So in the 1930s, when they were committing these acts, there were no legal instruments to say that they couldn't do this. Why not? So contrast the treatment of British and French prisoners of war by the Germans and the treatment of German Jewish people. So German Jewish people were exterminated in concentration camps, as well as communists and Roma. Whereas British and French and American prisoners of war were treated according to the Geneva Convention. Now, how could the Germans do this? How could they just, try and commit genocide? Legally, how could they do this? Sorry? Excellent, yeah. This is exactly the right answer. First, in 1938, you had the stripping of citizenship from Jews. This meant that Jews and also communists were people who were not safeguarded by any rights. So these were basically, if we look at Giorgio Agamben's work, homo sacer, they were disposable. They were basically reduced to bare life. There were no legal instruments to help them because they were no longer citizens. States cannot kill their citizens indiscriminately. But what the Germans did, the Nazis did, was basically to say, you are no longer our citizens. Because you are no longer our citizens, we can kill you. There's nothing to protect you. So I think it's very important to make the distinction between citizens and those people who live within a particular territory. What R2P does is to say that stripping people of their citizenship rights and then killing them is wrong. States cannot do this. So the way this works is if we look at the Yugoslav context, and if we look at the ethnic cleansing in the 1990s, which happened within Europe, which is very reminiscent, by the way, of partition violence in Punjab, and also Bengal. In many ways, it's like they copied it from partition violence. It's highly organized, and it was about territory. Ethnic cleansing does not mean killing, does not mean genocide. The difference between the two is genocide is trying to get rid of a whole group of people, a whole race of people. Ethnic cleansing is about territory. And who needs territory? States. States are defined by territory. So what this does, the 2001 report, an R2P, is to say to states that they have a responsibility to protect people who live within their territory. If a mass atrocity happens, then states will be held accountable. This is very different from ICC and criminal law, the International Criminal Court. Because what the International Criminal Court does is to try and make individual leaders accountable for these mass atrocities. This means spending a lot of money on trying to hire lawyers to get a very convincing case against people to prove that they willingly committed ethnic cleansing. Now, unfortunately, Slobodan Milosevic, who was indicted by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, died of a heart attack in 2001 before judgment could be reached. But I think he would have been acquitted. I think he would have been acquitted because it's impossible to actually prove culpability. I think in India you've had similar cases as well of proving culpability. But here, I think the main argument is states have the responsibility to protect people. So if a massacre of a certain ethnic minority happens in a particular state, then the government is held accountable even if they were not directly responsible. This is the way it changes international law and international relations. And if they don't, so this was the argument in Somalia or Sudan, particularly after Darfur, then humanitarian intervention is permitted. So if we come back to our example of Halabja, the Kurdish massacre in 1988, if we look at responsibility to protect, the argument is not that it was Saddam Hussein who gassed many Kurdish villages, but that a gassing took place. Because there was a gassing, the government should have prevented it. If they were not able to prevent it, then they should not control their territory. So it makes sovereignty conditional on protecting people. So this is a way of linking it to human security. Because ultimately, the sovereignty of states depends on their ability to protect the security of individuals. And if we look at implementing R2P, so implementing responsibility to protect, the 2009 report by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon specified 3 main pillars of responsibility to protect. The protection responsibilities of states, which I mentioned. The state is primarily responsible for protecting all people who live on its territory. International assistance and capacity building. If states are unable to do so, if they lack the capacity to protect its own people, then international assistance is required. Now, very controversially, I think Russia can probably argue this as a case for their intervention within Syria. They could say that the Syrian state lacks the capacity to maintain a monopoly of the use of force within their given territory. But usually it's not used. Finally, if states have the capacity to look after their own populations, yet are unwilling to do so, then a timely and decisive response is necessary. Now, what happened in 2011? And not much of a spring, to be honest. Libya, yeah. I remember going to a conference at JICA at the time on mainstreaming responsibility to protect, and I said, this is fine, but let's see if this has any impact in international relations whatsoever. And luckily for them, unluckily for me, along came a conflict, which was the Libyan conflict. So you had a UN Security Council support for a no-fly zone over Libya under UN Security Council Resolution 1973. The pretext for this was that the Libyan government forces under Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, who, by the way, invested quite a lot of money into human security in some institutions, including the one which I'm affiliated with, was using his own air force to bomb his own citizens in Benghazi, or people within their territory of control. Now, if we look at the national security paradigm, is he doing anything wrong? Using your own planes to bomb your own citizens. Are there any problems with it from the national security paradigm?
Not securing the people. Not according to national security, because they are allowed to do, they have sovereignty over their internal matters. Therefore,
It says nothing about the state using force against its own citizens. The state needs to protect you from external threats. It doesn't mention that the state itself could be a threat. And I remember listening to a lecture by Anthony Giddens, and he said, well, states have killed more people in the 20th century than died in wars. So maybe the state, which we look for our protection, is the main instrument here of insecurity. So interestingly, what happens with this no-fly zones? The no-fly zone says, look, you can't do this. You cannot bomb your own citizens. We're not going to allow you to fly your own airplanes over your own airspace. This is a direct violation of Libyan sovereignty. But it was ratified by the UN Security Council, including Russia. They voted for it. China, they voted for it. Who was it implemented by? Huh? NATO again. So again, NATO's role keeps on increasing. This is why human security is an important part of NATO doctrine. So with the formulation of human security, NATO's power and its interventions have increased. So NATO basically intervened within the Civil War. It wasn't really a no-fly zone. It was a no-fly zone for Libyan military aircrafts. And the regime of Colonel Gaddafi fell. But this shows the implementation. This was the litmus test for the implementation of R2P. The key question is, if Libya, then why not Syria? So this is, I think, a question which we need to bear in mind when we look at responsibility to protect. But this is a far narrower understanding of human security than the UNDP report. The UNDP was concentrating on non-traditional security threats, on the insecurity wrought by neoliberal globalization. Whereas the R2P report was looking mainly at the state itself. And their solution is really to strengthen the state. To strengthen the state so that the state is able to protect the people under its own control. So we have two very different conceptions of human security, which don't appear to be related to one another. So then we get the Commission for Human Security report, Human Security Now, chaired by Amartya Sen and Sadako Ogata, which is commissioned by Kofi Annan. And they were charged with coming up with a comprehensive understanding of human security. So the CHS report defines human security as protecting fundamental freedoms, which include freedom from fear and freedom from want, which are the two arguments which come from President Truman's speeches of the 1940s, 1947. Freedom from fear meant freedom from threats of violence by the state. Freedom from want meant to empower people so they were in a position where they could free themselves from material constraints, from hunger, from disease, from underdevelopment. We'll look more at the report in detail, but the important point to note is this was the first attempt at institutionalization within the UN system. So we have a human security unit, which was established in May 2004 in the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UN OCHA. And you now have a trust fund for, which was set up largely at the nation by the Japanese government, which basically keeps, it's a trust fund for human security. And it means that states can turn to the Human Security Trust Fund if there are certain projects which will enhance the security within their particular state. Now, this leads us, finally, to the UN General Assembly resolution of 2012. So this was the first time. I think the first point to make for non-IR specialists or non-specialists of international law is, unlike Security Council resolutions, General Assembly resolutions are not really binding. They're not binding. There's never actually an outcome which can be enforced. A great example was in 1974, you had the passing of the new international economic order at the behest of the group of 77 states, I think including India, and the non-aligned movement, which sought to fundamentally transform the nature of the international political economy. So it was basically a move, in Stephen Krasner's words, from market allocation to state allocation. Basically, the state played a key role in fixing commodity prices, and the attempt was made to try and create a more just economic order, which was geared towards the development needs of those societies which developed on, which relied upon the export of agricultural resources, such as India. This was not rejected, it was basically ignored. So if we look at General Assembly resolutions, what they are is really a non-binding, but they're a good litmus test of international opinion. So the point to make was that UN General Assembly adopts a resolution on human security. Now, why is this significant? Why would it be significant for the General Assembly to adopt a resolution on human security? What needs to what do you need to be in order to sit in the UN General Assembly? States. And what have we learned about states from human security, from the narrow and broad approach? Yeah, so basically states are approving that, are basically recognizing the fact that we can be a problem to our own citizens. So in this sense, it's quite a significant watershed. States are saying, look, our right to do what we want within our boundaries has limits, and the limits are imposed by the needs of the people who we try to protect. So the UN General Assembly adopts a resolution which starts very promisingly that human security is the right of people to live in freedom and dignity. And I think dignity is very important here as a concept. We'll look more at dignity tomorrow and on Friday. But in freedom and dignity, free from poverty and despair. So I think that's clear. Do you understand freedom, dignity, poverty and despair? Then it goes on. Human security calls for people-centered, so this is important, people-centered responses that strengthen the protection and empowerment of all people and all communities. Later, when we look at the narrow and broad approaches, I'm going to speak to protection and empowerment. So I'll define protection and empowerment in greater detail then. All of this is available on the internet free of charge, UN General Assembly Resolution in 2012, Resolution 290, so you should be able to look it up. Interestingly, the notion of human security is distinct from the responsibility to protect and its implementation. So it's basically going for a broader notion of human security. It's saying the focus should not really be on implementing responsibility to protect. Why would states say this? Why would states be reluctant to endorse the implementation of the responsibility to protect? Yep.
Because the responsibility to protect might be used, misused rather, as a mask for intervention, direct intervention.
Excellent. That would be precisely the view which states would give you. So that would be the view of most states, particularly in the global south. More cynically, you could say because this puts limitations, constraints upon their use of force within a given territory. So therefore, it qualifies its sovereignty. It qualifies state sovereignty. Then it goes on. Human security does not entail the threat or the use of force or coercive measures. Again, interesting. But what this means is that the narrow approach to human security is no longer seen as part of human security. The idea of responsibility to protect. Because when we look at responsibility to protect, if you cannot protect the people in the territory which you're protecting, then a timely and decisive response by the international community is necessary. So in this sense, force is built into human security. But this resolution says force does not entail it. It's not necessary. Then human security does not replace state security. So the idea here is that state human security strengthens the capacity of the state. It doesn't replace state security, but it coexists with state security. So let's go back to our lecture yesterday on globalization. So which school of thought was arguing that with globalization we don't get an erosion of state power, but the state is not the only actor? So this is a transformationist view. The state is still there. It's not like human security. The logic of human security is devolving power away from the state to the individual. And what the General Assembly resolution is saying is no, they are compatible. Basically, security is a good thing. States can give us security, but sometimes they can't. So basically, we need security, and the state should work with other non-state actors to provide us with security. Okay, I don't want to, in great detail, go to the 2016 report. We will look at this later in the course, particularly tomorrow. But I'll just briefly mention it. It is available. From Hybrid Peace to Human Security, Rethinking EU Strategy Towards Conflict. And it posits an idea of second generation of human security. Now, it's second generation human security because, as I'll argue tomorrow, human security has been heavily criticized. So therefore, there is a recent attempt made to respond to its critics and to incorporate a lot of the problems with original human security discourse. So second generation human security is about establishing legitimate political authority and legitimate livelihoods. All of this you can get from the report. The report is online. It encompasses multi-layer, incremental and inclusive peace processes with particular emphasis on support for local ceasefires and civil society, security assistance in establishing safe areas and safe corridors and protecting individuals and their communities, economic measures including justice to undercut the illegal economy. So the main argument here is a move towards a more local understanding of human security. I'll bring this in later in the course. But the important point, the important report here is the General Assembly report. And at this point, I would like to end our discussion of history and to return to different approaches. So before we go to different approaches, do you have any questions about the history? I am definitely going to finish the approaches before the end of the lecture. Any questions about the history? Yep.
I wish to understand this point in the report of the UN General Assembly.
Hmm.
The notion of human security is distinct from the responsibilities to protect.
Ask the question again.
So I wish to understand this point by the UN General Assembly report of 2012 that the notion of human security is distinct from the responsibility to protect and its implementation. So I just wish to understand.
Yeah, I think this is an excellent question. This is an excellent question because human security developed with both a narrow and broad approach, which I have not formally introduced to you yet. But what the General Assembly seems to be saying is to be preferring a broad approach, which is more like a UNDP, Commission for Human Security approach, rather than the approach taken by the International Commission for Intervention in State Sovereignty. So basically what states are saying is that we do not want to give you a pretext to intervene in our internal affairs. I think we have a very good example of this in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka under the government of Mahinda Rajapaksa, where there was evidence of mass atrocities. Now, it's very difficult under conventional international criminal law to say that President Mahinda Rajapaksa was responsible for intentionally shelling civilians in the northeast of Sri Lanka near Kilinochchi, killing 90,000 of its own citizens, something like 40 to 90,000. We don't even know what the figures were because the United Nations left. The United Nations left, like in Rwanda, because they were under fire. The Sri Lankan government said, we cannot guarantee your safety, so they left. Now, seen from the perspective of Sri Lanka and its backers, China, Iran, what the responsibility to protect would do would be to enable a power, let's say India, for example, to intervene, a regional power to intervene in its internal affairs. And remember, India did intervene within Sri Lanka's internal affairs back in the 1980s. So responsibility to protect is seen very much as a license to intervene.
Intervention of the consent of the state, they had that back. So in the state, they had that back.
In 1980, yes. In the 1980s, but not under responsibility to protect. Under responsibility to protect, it's this is a very important point. In classical humanitarian assistance or classical humanitarian intervention, you need to be invited in by the state. That's part of the problem with the UN system. You need to be invited in. Under responsibility to protect, nobody invited NATO in. Nobody even knew where NATO's address was. You know, who are you? They just intervened. So that's the danger of responsibility to protect. If we look at post-colonial states in general, not big, powerful states like India, but smaller post-colonial states would be very worried about responsibility to protect. I mean, don't forget, Libya was a very prosperous society. It was a very prosperous economy. It was the second largest oil producer per head in the world before the liberation or invasion, depending upon your perspective. So I think that clarifies the point of why the General Assembly would want to distance themselves from responsibility to protect. Responsibility to protect, the main advocates of the responsibility to protect are Australia. There's a big centre in the University of Queensland, the Responsibility to Protect Centre, and also Canada. So Australia and Canada are key powers who are promoting the idea of responsibility to protect. Whereas for the broad approach of human security, it's more UNDP, and also Japan has, because of its constitution, Japan cannot intervene militarily. So it's in the position of having to support a broader conception of human security. Any other questions of clarification before I go through the narrow and broad approaches? Yep.
In responsibility to protect report 2001 and
Yep.
Genesis report, it says states have the responsibility to protect its citizens.
Yeah, I should not have used the word citizens. What I was trying to say was to make the difference between citizens and people who live under its control.
So it's not necessarily
No. Citizens, they used it in the report, but I used it because it took less space than having to say people who live under the territory they control.
We have a very clear case in Myanmar.
Yes, very good. If we look at, I've written about this actually. If you go to academia.edu, I think I've uploaded the chapter with a student looking at the Rohingya and within the confines of critical human security. And I think the case can be made that the Rohingya have not been protected. The Myanmarese state, even under Aung San Suu Kyi, not just the military regime, but the transition regime which we have now, has failed in its responsibility to protect particularly the cultural rights of the Rohingya. But that's based on cultural rights. So the argument which is made against the Myanmarese state is that the military government itself is carrying out systematic human rights abuses. So the point we make in the article is that actually it is the Myanmarese state is carrying out or systematically denying for want of a better expression, the rights of the Rohingya and Muslim Myanmarese citizens to be considered Myanmarese citizens. Yeah, the analogy here is with Nazi Germany. So with Nazi Germany, you have the stripping of the citizenship rights, and under, I think, the very recent Marriage Act, there's a Marriage Control Act which makes it illegal for a non-Muslim to marry a Muslim Myanmarese citizen. So it's a real intrusion into the private sphere. And I think there are similarities if we look at Myanmar with Nazi Germany, in its, not in the idea of genocide, but in its treatment, its othering. The argument we use is how they strip citizenship rights of Myanmarese Muslims, and how this can be seen as a form of human insecurity. So it's not just direct killing, but it's stripping people of their citizenship rights, which can be seen as a source of violation of human security. But sorry? Yeah, but then we have to be clear, because that's why I need to tell you more about the broad and narrow approach. Because if we look at ethnic cleansing has a specific technical meaning. So I think retroactively, we could apply ethnic cleansing to partition-based violence. Yugoslavia is when the term ethnic cleansing was introduced. So the main argument, or the main objective of ethnic cleansing is to cleanse a particular territory of its minorities. So this is linked to state formation. I would say that in a way this is what's happening within Myanmar. But the Myanmarese state, unlike partition violence or in Yugoslavia, is not necessarily killing all its Muslim citizens. But it is depriving them of their rights to be Myanmarese citizens. So we have to be careful in terms of using the term ethnic cleansing, because it is associated with direct physical violence.
The state apparatus.
Sorry?
The state apparatus is not.
You need to put the microphone on.
Means the state apparatus is not directly involved in killing.
Yeah, that's what ethnic cleansing would mean.
But what about the timely and decisive intervention when something happens in the country? I mean, it is the duty of the state to timely and decisively,
Well,
intervening.
if we look at Myanmar, the idea of responsibility to protect was invoked, but it wasn't invoked in relation to the Rohingya. It was invoked in relation to Cyclone Nargis. And the French ambassador said, we can invoke responsibility to protect because the Myanmarese government is not able to protect its citizens from the cyclone, from the tropical cyclone. So it has actually been invoked. But the point I'm trying to make in relation to Myanmar is, if we use a term like ethnic cleansing, even though I'd agree with the argument you're making, and I have agreed with that argument, we have to be careful about the way in which ethnic cleansing is used in the conventional international legal literature. It's a new concept. but cleansing means killing people, cleansing a particular territory of people. By making them refugees, by forcing them to flee, you're not actually engaging in ethnic cleansing, legally. But the objective is the same. It's a different means to the same end. Anyway, I think what I should do is, in the time we have remaining, just to make sure that you're in a position to answer the question tomorrow, we should do the narrow and the broad approach to human security. I will show this again in the beginning of the lecture, but I assume, sorry. Okay. So from the perspective of the narrow approach to human security, and this is in the Human Security Report 2005, which I think is included in your reading, or it could be, I've included the 2011 report, which is the shrinking costs of war. So that's in, you have the reading. Human security is seen as the protection of individual from violent threats. These violent threats are threats of direct physical violence. So this approach is linked with the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, and it shares the same conceptual terrain as the responsibility to protect. So the 2001 report, which said states have a responsibility to protect their citizens. If they don't, humanitarian intervention is permitted. So the objective of this approach is to protect, not to empower, to protect individual human beings from sources of repression. So to protect individuals from their state. How can this be done? By collective intervention by other states. So this will be the narrow approach to human security. And we have an example of this in the UN authorization of a no-fly zone over Libya. So if we go back to the ICISS report, the main reason why it was set up was to clarify the grounds for humanitarian intervention. So on the one hand, we found a suspected genocide in Rwanda in which 800,000 people die in 6 weeks, which is similar, if not more, than partition violence. It's a significant number, and you have no intervention by the international community to stop it. The intervention actually came from the RWPF, which was the Rwandan People's Patriotic Front, and under Paul Kagame. So although it was supported by other states or other groups, the ethnic cleansing was brought to an end by the efforts of Tutsi-based militias. Then we have Kosovo. In the case of Kosovo, we have intervention by NATO without explicit UN authorization and/or consultation. So the benefit of the narrow approach is that it institutionalizes the grounds for intervention, and the objective for intervention is to protect the individual human being from threats of physical violence. Okay, any questions on the narrow approach? I think this should be quite easy to understand. Any questions? So hunger, disease are not seen as illiteracy, lack of education, are not seen as human security issues. Human security issues are narrowly defined. The advantage of it if we look at Roland Paris's perspective, is we can do something about it. It's narrowly defined. So if we look at Myanmar, if violence is used, then the international community has to respond. If we look at Sri Lanka, if violence has been used against the individual citizens or individual people living within Sri Lanka, and the government has not protected them, then intervention is necessary. Any questions on the narrow approach? Yep.
Sir, who will decide when the point time has come to intervention? Because it is actually NATO who is deciding when to intervene or not. If it is UN intervening, that is okay. International community is yet involved.
Okay, this is an excellent point. So who decides who to intervene? This is the problem. We don't have a global state. But there is a difference between 1999 and 2011. The difference is in 1999, NATO intervened. There was not even a discussion within the United Nations. In fact, there was a UN Security Council resolution by China and Russia which sought to censure NATO, which declared the intervention illegal. That actually failed. A majority of states voted against it. But in 2011, first you had UN Security Council Resolution 1973. Then you had intervention. That's the difference. First you had a UN resolution, and then there was the question of intervention. Now, UN Security Council 1973 did not sanction NATO. It did not say, NATO, you can intervene. But NATO at least had a legal framework for intervening, so their intervention could no longer be seen as illegal. But the key question is, of course, who gets...
Why isn't it illegal?
What?
Why isn't NATO intervention illegal? It is not mandated by the UN.
In 2011, you're correct. It was not mandated by the UN, but there was UN Security Council Resolution 1973, which permitted some international response. So there is a possibility for NATO to intervene. There is a legal case which they can make.
Means there can be some other organizations if they are as powerful as NATO, they can intervene?
Well, this is why I say look at Syria. Because one argument the Russians are not making in Syria is we have a responsibility to protect Syria by intervening within their civil war. What Russia is doing in Syria, arguably, is what NATO did in Libya. So I think this is part of the challenge. Our question, a really good question, one of my students attempted it for his master's thesis, was why intervention in Libya and not Syria? The problem was he graduated before there was any decision on Syria whatsoever. We had no idea what was happening with Syria. And just when he was about to submit, there was a possibility of NATO intervening over the use of chemical weapons. And then all of a sudden ISIS came along and everything became very different. But yeah, this is the key question. You know, why Libya and not Syria? This is a problem with this approach.
Actually, it is power which decides what is legal and illegal.
Sorry?
It is actually the state's power which decides what is legal and illegal.
That would be the realist critique. The realist critique of the narrow approach to human security would be it's up to states to decide what is, when you say legal and illegal, I wouldn't say legal and illegal, because if we look at the idea of legality in Kosovo in 1999, that was illegal. In 2011, it was legal, but states don't care. I think the best analogy is with the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and Kosovo in 1999. So many people have argued that this was just George W. Bush's decision. He wanted to intervene. And if you listen to Tony Blair's testimony to the Chilcot report, it was Blair who was saying, look, let's take this to the United Nations. Bush had made up his mind, I'm going to intervene anyway. And then Colin Powell and Tony Blair said, look, let's take it to the United Nations. Let's get one resolution. Let's try and get a second. They invaded before the second resolution. But the point was, there was a pretext in international law. NATO intervened within Kosovo, so the US intervention within Iraq could have been construed as legal if they had used this argument of responsibility to protect. But they didn't. They used the argument of weapons of mass destruction, which made the US invasion of Iraq under international law, most realists would say it's illegal. It was a stupid war and it was an illegal war. That was the main argument. Whereas if they'd used responsibility to protect, they may have won the debate. They may have won the second debate. That's why many liberals supported the invasion of Iraq in 2003. But most realists opposed it. Okay, let's move on because I want to look at the broad approach before we conclude. Now, the broad approach to human security really comes out of the original impulse of the United Nations Development Report of 1994 and the Commission for Human Security Report of 2003. If we look at the CHS report in particular, it defines human security as encompassing the vital core of all human lives, a set of elementary rights and freedoms people enjoy and consider to be vital to their well-being. The vital core is not specified. So when Sabine Alkira writes this phrase, the vital core, it's basically what enables you to feel human. So this is different from responsibility to protect and the narrow approach. For the narrow approach, the assumption is that we are secure. We are secure unless somebody threatens us with violence. That's a source of insecurity. From the broad approach, we're not looking at freedom from. So Sir Isaiah Berlin made a distinction between freedom to and freedom from. Freedom from meant freedom from violence, freedom from having loud music played at night. This is different from freedom to. Freedom to is the ability to enjoy something. Freedom to play loud music at night. Freedom to live a fulfilling life. So the objective of human security is thus to protect the vital core of human lives in ways that enhance human freedoms and human fulfillment. This means not just freedom from physical threats of violence, but freedom to be able to participate in a self-governing polity, freedom to be able to eat, to be educated, to have medical insurance. However, protection alone is seen as insufficient to combat human insecurity. Human security seeks also to empower people to act on their own behalf. Now, this is the key question. The key concept, empowerment. So, what do you understand by empowerment? Those of you working within the development sector, within gender, within education, would have come across this word time and time again. What do you understand by empowerment?
Free decision making.
Put the microphone.
Free
Free.
decision making.
Yeah, but you're right. It's about the ability to make decisions. But yeah, go on. Yeah, this is the main point. The assumption of human security is that we are self-determining individuals. We are able to make decisions on our own behalf. What empowerment says is there's certain people who cannot make decisions on their own behalf because they lack education. They lack entitlements. This is the key words. So once they're in a position to realize the choices which they face, they can exercise freedom. For Amartya Sen, freedom under the capability approach means being able to exercise choices. In order to exercise a choice, you need to be able to see choices. So Sen's perhaps most important work was when he was a younger student at London School of Economics and even before in Bengal, when he looked at the Great Bengal Famine of 1942. And he contrasted this with the fact that after independence, India never went through a particular famine. There was never a famine like the Great Leap Forward within China or the Great Bengal Famine in 1942. And for Sen, it wasn't about lack of food. There was enough food there. It was about lack of entitlement to that food. So in 1942, he was a young boy growing up in Dhaka, I think, and he saw how food went to feed the soldiers fighting the Japanese in Myanmar, in Burma. Even though people were, starving to death all around him, there was enough food, but the people did not have entitlements to this food. After independence, everybody in India had entitlements to food under certain food security acts. Even if there wasn't enough food, there would be enough to prevent starvation. Now, this was Sen's argument about famines, but there was a problem. The problem was, as you'll know, when we look at India, although there was no famines, everybody knows that they're entitled to food. So what's very interesting, if you look at the statistics, and this is what Sen did with his work with Jean Drèze, is to look at the correlation between illiteracy and malnutrition. So you'll find the illiterate populations, people who cannot read and write, are those who are most vulnerable to malnutrition because they don't know that they have entitlements. Also, landless laborers. So I talked in a previous class about landless laborers in a place I sort of know quite well, which is Punjab. Many of them would have residency in Bihar. They'll be entitled to food in Bihar, but they'd have to go back to Bihar to claim that food. So if they lose their job within Punjab, they still have to come back to Bihar in order to get food. They don't have any entitlements to food within Punjab. So what Sen basically did was to show how these different freedoms are linked. So in order to exercise our choices, in order to eat, in this sense, you first need to be able to read and write. And in certain traditional societies, if women are not allowed to be engaged in labor activities or in education, this means women are more vulnerable than men, and they don't know about their entitlements when it comes to food. So protection alone here is seen as insufficient. What needs to be done is people need to be empowered. They need to be educated. And one of the most important parts of empowerment is you need to be healthy. You may have a lot of choices available to you, but if you're not healthy and you don't have medical insurance, then you don't live. So life expectancy is a key criteria of human development, and it should be a key litmus test for human security. We shouldn't be making an arbitrary distinction between people who are killed by their state and people who die, not naturally, but people who die before they should die. So I think what Sen's argument, not just Sen, but what the broad approach to human security tells us is we can be insecure even if nobody is threatening us. Security is not a natural state. Security is a project. We have to work towards human security. If we want to live in a world where everybody is free from fear and free from want and is able to make decisions on their own behalf, then individual human beings need to be in a position where they're able to exercise these choices. And in order to exercise these choices, you need to be able to see those choices. If you don't see those choices, then you need to be empowered. Human security, therefore, involves not only protecting, but empowering individual human beings. Now, any questions on the broad approach? Because we finished the lecture. I'm going to look at the question for discussion. Our discussion is 1 hour tomorrow. So you have another 30 minutes for discussion tomorrow. Any questions on the broad approach? No comments. You have enough time for comments tomorrow. Yep.
So these instances actually broad approach is not specific about the humanitarian intervention. They are silent, I think.
Exactly. Very good point. Use of force. Where is the use of force? There is no use of force. How can you force people to go to school? Actually, people are being forced to go to school, but the point is you can't use military force to get people to go to school. And even if they do go to school, you can't force them to actually learn how to read or write. You don't put a gun to their head and say, if you don't get 50% in your spelling test, we will kill you. You can't do that. Very good point. There isn't the use of force. This is why Roland Paris and other critics say human security has been broadened to such an extent that it's the same as development. So it loses its analytical purchase. So when we're confronted by Libya, when we're confronted by Syria, when we're confronted by Myanmar or Sri Lanka, we can't intervene. We can't intervene because the argument is, oh, there's insecurity everywhere. If we intervene within Sri Lanka, we have to intervene within Odisha because 50% of the population of Odisha are malnourished or illiterate. So this is part of the problems of the broad approach of human security. Or, from the other perspective, it's part of the advantage, the attractiveness of this approach is it does not sanction violence.
It's about the, as in the vital core of all the human beings. What is the vital core? Is there such a group set of vital core which is applied universally?
No, this is a question for you to answer. Because if for you there is no vital core, then there's no broad approach to human security. But the argument is we cannot specify what the vital core is. The vital core is what's important for you to feel secure. But what Al-Kira and the others believe is this vital core can be measured. So look at the Human Development Report indexes. The statistics are amazing. If you look at the World Bank report, you have to pay for it for a start. UNDP reports are all available online, so you can download it. You'll find 10 pages of statistics looking at economic indicators. If you look at the Human Development Report, you have about 200 pages of statistics, 49 different indicators, from gender equality, life expectancy, literacy, illiteracy, political participation. So if you want an answer in terms of what is the vital core, they would say look at a UN Human Development Report. But I think the advantage of the vital core, why I like the vital core, is it leaves it to us. It's a subjective concept. They're trying to objectify it, but it's a subjective concept. What it means for us to feel secure. But it's not specified in the report. But it is specified if you look at UNDP literature. Then they do specify. Any other questions or clarification before we go?